as far as what we're doing tonight, we're going to look at what is campaign finance to begin with. What does that even mean? And we're going to break it down a little bit. We're going to look at political action committees, which are commonly known as PACs. And you have your regular PACs, and then you're going to have your super PACs, which we're also going to talk about. We're going to look at some Supreme Court cases, some old ones, some recent ones that have impacted exactly what campaign finance means and how much money people, groups, whatever it might be, can contribute. We're going to look at the Federal Election Commission, the FEC, when and why it was created, what its role is within our government. We're going to look at a couple different types of money that you might hear get thrown around. So we'll talk about hard money, we'll talk about soft money, and then we'll finish the stream by talking about dark money. And then I have two practice multiple choice questions that we can go over. But again, as we're going along, one, I know I talk fast. Two, I have a lot to say because this is a meaty topic. But please feel free to ask questions, and I'll kind of check as I'm getting closer to the end of each slide if there's any questions I can answer. So we're going to kick off the stream by jumping right into the basics and talking about what campaign finance is to begin with. Mark Hanna, who was a political boss of a political machine years ago, said that there are two things that are important in politics. The first, he said, is money, and he can't remember what the second is, right? And that kind of sums up campaign finance in a sense. And what we see with campaign finance is that we really have the entanglement of money and politics coming together. And we're going to see as our country was progressing and we were moving on, that entanglement that was taking place, as you can see, my cats are going to get involved here, that entanglement that would take place between money and politics was going to keep growing, especially as our country got wealthier. New means of campaigns were being created. What we're spending now on campaigns is much more than we've ever spent on campaigns in the past. Just give me a second so I can get these guys out of the way here. Hold on 1 second. All right, guys, get down. You and you. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the FEC. So the FEC was created in 1971. What Congress is going to pass is a Federal Election Campaign Act at this point in time. The Federal Election Campaign Act is going to tighten the reporting requirements. So we're going to see that campaigns, political parties have to report where their money is coming from and where that money is going, and that's because of the FECA. And it's going to limit candidates' expenditures. So it's going to place limits on how much money candidates are allowed to spend. But we're going to see that this law was passed in 1971. But even despite this law, the next presidential election that comes right after it, which is the 1972 presidential race, in which Richard Nixon was running against George McGovern, we're going to see that they spent $91 million in that campaign. And then we're going to have things like Watergate take place during Richard Nixon's presidency. And we're going to see that the White House and Richard Nixon were involved kind of not so much in the scandal itself, but the cover-up of the scandal. And that's going to make Americans really kind of take a look at the fact that do we really need to look more at how much government is how much our politicians are spending on these campaigns. And so that's why we're going to see in 1974, Congress is going to pass an amendment to that 1971 FECA law. And this amendment is going to do a couple things, which I've kind of listed on the slide, but I'll talk about. So the 1974 law prevented donors from giving more than $1,000 to any federal candidate and more than $5,000 to a political committee in each election. And just important to understand when we say each election, primaries and general elections are considered, are each considered a different election, which means you as an individual could give $1,000 during a primary to a presidential candidate who's running for their party's nomination. And then during the general election, according to this law, you could then give another $1,000 because primaries and general elections would be separate elections. This law is going to cap the total a candidate could donate to his or her own campaign and set a maximum of how much the campaign could spend. So the law also, the biggest thing the law really does is create what's known as the Federal Election Commission, the FEC, and the responsibility of the FEC is to monitor and enforce the regulations. It also creates a legal definition for political action committees, making donations to campaigns, and it basically declares that they must have a political action committee must have at least 50 members, donate to at least 5 candidates, and register with the FEC at least 6 months in advance of the election. So those are all things that this law does. It's a very important law that took place. And again, this is an amendment to the original 1971 law. But the biggest thing we see coming out of this are those different caps that it places as far as how much individual donors can donate, as well as the creation of the FEC, which is really going to be there to monitor. And we'll get into talking about the FEC much more. Anyone have a question? I'm just going to go to the next slide. But if you have a question, let me know now before I jump into the types of PACs that our country has. Oh, these cats. Okay, buddy. So as far as political action committees, so we're going to talk about political action committees, and then we're also going to talk about what are known as super PACs, super political action committees. But campaign finance laws have defined several different types of political action committees, right? And they're defined by how they are formed, how they are funded, and how they are allowed to disperse their funds. Some also have different limits on the donation amount from individuals per year or election. So for instance, one type of PAC is known as a connected PAC. Corporations, labor unions, trade organizations, they're not allowed to use money from their treasuries to influence elections. However, they are allowed to form what's known as a connected PAC, which is a political action committee funded separately from the organization's treasury through donations from members. And they're allowed to make limited campaign contributions in that way. Sometimes connected PACs can also be referred to as separate segregated funds, or otherwise known as SSF. And this is just because of the way money is separated from the sponsoring organization's treasuries. They cannot solicit donations from anyone who is not a member of the organization. So that is what we would call our connected PACs. As far as non-connected PACs, these political action committees have no sponsoring organization, and a lot of times they're going to form around a single issue. So they're allowed to solicit funds from anyone in the general public, and they're allowed to make direct donations to candidates up to the limits that laws have set. So like connected PACs, non-connected PACs must register with the FEC and disclose who their donors are. So let's talk about a couple different types of non-connected PACs. So one would be leadership PACs. They can be started by any current or former elected official, and they're allowed to raise money from the general public. Though they can't be used to fund the official's own campaign, funds in a leadership PAC can be used to cover travel and other expenses that they might have within that campaign. So that's important to understand. I'm sorry, these cats are really causing trouble. That's important to understand about leadership PACs. Hold on 1 second. This guy is being a real tool tonight. Okay. Another type of non-connected PAC, and this is a type that's getting a lot more attention lately, especially in the 2016 election because of the immense amount of money that was spent, would be super PACs. And super PACs are the newest kind of political action committee. We're going to see that they really came out of a court case we're going to be jumping into in a little bit that was known as Citizens United versus FEC, and also another court case, Speech Now versus FEC. Both of those cases being decided in 2010, and we're going to talk about those cases in a second. But what we're going to see with super PACs is that they're allowed to receive unlimited donations. They can raise and spend as much as they want, and provide, and the key here is that they must disclose their donors. But what's interesting is they're not allowed to coordinate with any candidate. So that's a big thing here, right? So they can receive unlimited donations, meaning they can receive all the money in the world as long as they disclose their donors, and they can't coordinate with any specific candidate. What we sometimes see happening too that can kind of fall into this super PAC category are known as 501c4 organizations. Now, 501c4 organizations, what we see happening are the super PACs will donate to several 501c4 organizations, and then when 501c4 organizations get that money, they don't have to disclose. They don't have to disclose their donors, and they can spend that money freely. And that's going to be known as dark money. And we're going to get into talking about dark money a little bit more and what 501c4 means. Just important to understand that we do have in this situation a situation where we see a lot of the super PACs donating to these 501c4 organizations. Now, in total in our country, we see a lot of money being donated to these PACs as far as how much you can donate individually and, as a group, whatever. And we're going to get more into talking about the specifics of how much individuals are allowed to donate and all of that when we get into our next slide. But does anyone have any questions about PACs in general before we start talking about some of those court cases I had mentioned? All right, so to jump into these court cases that you should know, especially for the AP exam. So the first court case we're going to talk about is Buckley versus Valeo, and this is going to be in 1976. This is going to be one of the first challenges to the FEC law. In January of 1975, a group of conservatives and liberals are basically joining together to overturn the Federal Election Campaign Act in the courts. The New York Senator James Buckley, he's a conservative. He's going to team up with Democratic Senator Eugene McCarthy, who actually also ran for president at one point in time. And they're going to team up with the American Civil Liberties Union and the American Conservation Union to file this suit. And they're going to file it against the Secretary of the United States at the time, who is Francis Valeo. What's interesting is you will never, ever, ever see these groups coming together in a court case. This is a very rare situation where they're actually all in agreement. But their argument is that early 1970s law, the FECA, unconstitutionally limits free speech. And so what the court rules in this case is they upheld the law. They upheld the law's $1,000 limit on individual donations and the $5,000 limit on political action committees, claiming such limits don't violate free speech guarantees. However, the court also ruled that Congress cannot limit a candidate's donation to his or her own campaign or spending his or her own money. So what it says here is the fact that we're not going to change what the law said as far as what individuals are allowed to donate. What we will change is the fact that if a candidate is running for office, it's not fair for this law to say, well, this candidate can only spend X amount of their own money. And so that's the one change that the Supreme Court made about that law, that a candidate's donation to his or her own campaign cannot be changed. And it also can't place the maximum number on overall receipts, meaning the government, Congress, can't say candidates are only allowed to spend this amount of money on the campaign. That's something they're not allowed to do. And then the other case, a much more recent case that got a lot of notoriety at the time that it was taking place. It's hard for me to believe that this was actually 9 years ago because it's so fresh in my memory as far as listening to it on the news. But that court case is going to be Citizens United. Hold on one second. Let's get him down. Citizens United versus the United States. And in this court case, what we found was that corporations and other organizations have a similar right to free speech as individuals, is what the Citizens United court case said. So corporations, labor unions, and other organizations are now allowed to use funds from their treasuries to endorse or denounce a candidate at any time, provided that they are not coordinating with any other candidate. So this is huge. This court case was huge in its ruling of what it said and what it was going to allow. And I'm sure your teachers in class are going to read a lot from the court case of Citizens United, just because of the different impacts that it was going to have. And the whole thing here with Citizens United is this whole argument about free speech, right? Everyone was arguing that you can't place limits on what corporations can do because of the idea of free speech. And by what Citizens United did, as far as saying that, yes, labor unions, organizations are entitled to the same free speech that an individual has, by doing that, they're going to open up this door to what is later going to become known as dark money being used in campaigns. And we're going to talk about in a little bit what exactly that means, dark money being used in campaigns. But what's important to understand is that Citizens United, the big takeaway that you have to take from Citizens United, is that it's going to open the door for corporations to make political contributions to a committee, as long as that committee did not formally coordinate with a candidate. And so that's going to be huge to understand now. Questions about either of these court cases? Again, I'm just going to switch slides, but I'll give you a second if you want to ask a question. All right, we'll keep going then. So what's important to understand as far as fundraising is concerned, when anytime a presidential candidate is running for office, they're going to want to obviously raise money in order to finance their campaign, right? Like, it's necessary. You can't run for office if you don't have any money to finance your campaign. You need to be able to purchase commercials, pay for ads on social media, pay for all your travel to different states that you're going to campaign in and make speeches in. So what we see is that some candidates will finance their own campaigns, but most candidates, for the most part, right, are going to rely on the party's organization and thousands of individual donors for contributions. What is known, the war chest, is basically all of that candidate's money, wherever it's coming from. So the candidate's war chest could be their own money. It could be money that is coming from individual donors like yourself if you decide to donate to a candidate. It could be coming from the political party. So if they're running for the Democratic Party usually helps to finance some. If they're running for the Republican Party will usually help to finance some. But that war chest and the size of your war chest, aka the size of your bank account, the amount of money you have to spend for campaigning, that can play a role in determining whether you as a candidate might win or lose. If you have a small war chest, it's not impossible that you will win, but it's going to make it much more difficult for you to win if you are going against a candidate who has a very large war chest. And we're going to see that this campaign to get financial resources starts pretty early, right? So if you think about it, President Trump, the day he won the election, and then after he was getting inaugurated, he was already filing paperwork to run for office in the 2020 election, which would allow him to actually, at that point in time, start collecting money from individual donors that he could hold on to for this upcoming election. If you think of our Democratic candidates who are currently running in the primaries, right? A lot of them announced a good year ago that they were going to run in the primaries that don't start until next year. The reason they announced so early was so that they could start building their war chest, right? Get their names out there. So ideally, people would start donating money to them. So it's important to understand that it begins a long time before you actually even start worrying about getting the votes for office. Fundraising also allows candidates to test their chances, right? So those who can get a lot of money, gather funds, they can begin to prove that they're going to have a level of support that are voting for them that make them a good candidate. Most successful House candidates spend about $1 million during a 2-year campaign. In more competitive markets or districts, you might see a little bit more than that. And to raise that cash over a 2-year period, because remember, House representatives, you have to run every 2 years. To raise that cash, candidates are going to spend about 1/4 of their campaign schedule making personal phone calls and holding formal fundraisers. Senate candidates, they're running statewide. It's every 6 years. They're going to spend about $12 million in their campaign, just because, again, it's statewide. It's not by the district. And also, usually, you're going to be running against someone also statewide. So there's just going to be more back and forth with the amount of money being spent between the candidates. If you look right now, as far as the importance of money in our Democratic primaries that are taking place, because there are so many candidates running in a Democratic primary, one of the caveats that the Democratic Party has given as far as who's allowed on the debate stage to try to limit the amount of candidates that are on the debate stage. One of the things that the Democratic Party has made it is you have to raise X amount of money to even get on that Democratic primary stage, and it has to be from X amount of people because they want to make sure that there's just not some heavy-handed donors coming in. So again, raising money early is super important, not only to increase your war chest so you have the money to run and to get ads and do all that, but it's also super important in this case, whereas the Democratic primary is only allowing certain people to get on the stage because of that. In 1998, things changed a little bit as far as getting your war chest together, in the sense that the internet became much more relevant, and the internet really became a campaign and fundraising tool for candidates. By 2002, 57% of all House Representative candidates and almost every single Senate candidate used the web or email to get money. So now you don't have to just ship a check through the mail to support a candidate. You can go, right to their website and type in your credit card information and donate right there. That type of solicitation, web and email, is free. So, you can easily send emails to a mass of people for free asking for money. Whereas if you think about it, when you used to have to send letters through the mail asking for money, like stamps and stuff like that, that's going to add up. So campaigns are actually saving money because of the internet and the use of email, and the fact that they don't have to mail things as much as they used to. So that's really important to understand as well. So that's all different ways to build up the war chest, because fundraising is so key. We'll be moving into talking about the FEC itself in a second, but any questions, again, please feel free to ask. All right, so the Federal Election Commission, more commonly you'll hear it on TV being referred to as the FEC. They're very unique and they carry out several responsibilities. So the president of our country appoints the FEC's Board of Commissioners to oversee election law, and then the Senate has to approve them. This commission is always going to have an equal number of Democrats and Republicans. The FEC requires candidates to register or to file their candidacy and to report campaign donations and expenses on a quarterly basis. So every 3 months, the treasurer of a campaign has to file a report with the FEC saying what donations that candidate has received in the last 3 months, who those donations came from. Did it come from an individual? Did it come from an organization? If it came from an individual, they will list that individual's name, their address, and their occupation. So all this is, again, every 3 months reported to the FEC. So say an individual donates during the first quarter, and then they also donate during the second quarter. Their individual donations for each quarter have to be reported, but then the treasurer of that candidate also needs to report what that person has donated within that time frame. So that's important to understand, that all of this is being held accountable by the FEC. A candidate's entire balance sheet is available to the government and to the public. So we have access to all of this information that is being sent to the FEC as far as how much money is being donated. And I believe Hey Dakota, nice to see you. Thanks for joining. It's nice to always have a friendly face. You're just a little late. My cat, you haven't missed out on my cat's blocking the screen. But so the quarterly reports for all of these filings that the treasurers have to do can be found in two locations. One is FEC.gov. Their website's a little bit more difficult, in my opinion, to maneuver. See, Frankie wants to come and say hi now too. Their website's a little more difficult to maneuver, but opensecrets.org is an awesome website. You go to that website, you can search by people's names. So if you want to check out if your parents have donated to a political campaign, you can just go and type in their name and it'll pop up. Or you can actually also search by typing in the zip code of where you're from or any zip code in the United States. And that will give you the information of all the people within the community who have donated. It'll tell you how much they've donated, if they've donated to a political candidate, if they've donated to a political action committee. And so all that information is there for you at your hands. And it has to be according to the election laws that have been established. And that's one of the biggest responsibilities of the FEC is every quarter to publish this information for the public to see. So that's important to understand. Matching money, what we're going to find about matching money, so the Supreme Court case we talked about earlier, which was Buckley versus Valeo. In that court case, we had talked about as far as contributions and what can be done with contributions. And so what we're going to see as far as matching money is concerned, in 1976, the federal government is going to kind of develop this system, so to speak, that's going to offer public financial support for presidential candidates who meet certain qualifications. So in this system today, everyone who files a tax return, so whenever I file my tax return on April 15th, I try to get in before that, but I'm offered a chance to contribute $3 of taxes to be redirected to the presidential campaign fund. Now, this isn't me contributing $3 extra. This is $3 that I've already spent in taxes. I can say, instead of going, this is directly where I want to go in the government, which would be to this campaign fund. And then the federal government will then use that money to match specified donations given to candidates in both the primary and general elections. Basically, the federal government will match dollar for dollar individual donations of $250 or less. But in order to qualify for this federal government matching program, candidates must contribute no more than $50,000 of their own money. And they must also raise at least $5,000 in each of 20 states in increments of $250 or less. And there's a couple of reasons why there are these specifications. One, the guidelines are put into place to ensure that candidates really have a broad base of support, right? So that's why they put in place this $20 different states you have to get this money from, because it's going to show a broad base of support. And also the other reason is because they're trying in a way to cut down on the amount of money that's being spent on campaigns, and they feel as though this is a way to do this. What we've seen, though, is no candidate has accepted this matching money concept due to the fact that they're not going to have as much money at their disposal to spend in the campaign, right? And if they're going, both candidates who were running kind of made the pact, okay, we'll both do this, it would make sense. But if one candidate makes a pact, but then the other candidate's going to spend this like exorbitant amount of money, it makes it really difficult. So we haven't really seen anyone take the government up. Was the first campaign finance reform bill in the 90s. There have been actually a bunch of great questions, Dakota. There's been a bunch of campaign finance reform bills. So like there was the first bill itself, the FECA, that came about in 1971. And then in 1974, like 3 short years later, they added a huge amendment to it. So there's definitely been a bunch of campaign finance reform bills. The one I believe you're referring to is the one that came out during the 90s with like Newt Gingrich and the contract with America that was going on. So that, yes, definitely was, that was definitely an important campaign finance reform bill. Just know it wasn't the first one. Like we've definitely had a bunch through the years. It was interesting. We had a chunk in the 70s, not so much anything going on in the 80s. And then in the 90s, when we saw the escalating costs of these campaigns, in the 90s, that's when we saw more campaign finance reform bills come about. And then we're going to see in 2002 another one come about as well. But great question, Dakota. So as far as hard money and soft money is concerned, there's a couple different things to understand between the difference of these two. So hard money are donations that are given directly to a candidate. These donations can be traced, they can be regulated, because again, remember, every quarter these candidates have to report to the FEC where they're getting their money from, who is giving it to them. So that's going to be hard money if it's being given directly to a candidate. So hard money is very much regulated, and it doesn't get called into question often because of how well it's regulated. Whereas sometimes people are like, things can get a little bit shady. That's going to be with soft money. Soft money are donations to a political party or to an interest group. And this money isn't tracked, right? So this money isn't going to be tracked like we see with hard money. So what ends up happening is the political party could really flood a congressional district with telephone ads, right, that are painting the opponent in a bad light, causing a lot of bad things for the opponent. And that's going to then make it easier for the candidate of the political party they were trying to represent do well. So let me try to explain this a little bit better and a little bit more clear. Let's say when you're watching TV, right, and we're starting to see them now, you're seeing these political commercials come on TV. At the end of every political commercial, or even throughout the commercial on the very bottom, it has to tell you who that political commercial was paid for, right? So like the other day in New Jersey, we're getting a lot of Tom Steyer commercials. So at the end of his commercials, it'll say like, I'm Tom Steyer and I approve this message. And then you'll see it says like paid for by Tom Steyer, this and that. That's an example of hard money, okay? Because that's the candidate directly creating the commercial from money that was donated specifically to the candidate. Soft money might be like sometimes during the last election, you might have veterans groups. You might have, I know there were like moms for gun control groups making commercials. Again, in New Jersey, we get a lot of commercials from the Sandy Hook Promise because Connecticut and the Sandy Hook massacre that took place are so close. So those groups are more considered soft money, right? So those are groups that are taking in money. They're not really specifically or necessarily endorsing a political candidate. But what they're doing is they're kind of talking bad about someone. So they're not coming out and saying, I think you should vote for candidate A. But what they will do is tell you all the reasons you shouldn't vote for candidate B. And so that's an example of soft money where it's not coming from the candidate. And political parties will do this as well, right? So political parties, you'll see, might say like paid for by the Republican Party or paid for by the Democratic Party. And it's the same concept. And so with soft money, because that money is not as easily traced, people are saying it's a little bit more shady because of that. And what we've seen, especially recently, is that people are making more donations to soft money because it's a way for them to, one, donate more money, and two, it's a way for them to get around some of the FEC laws. So we might in the future, like Dakota, almost back to your question, like we've seen all these different campaign reform acts, take place. We might in the future, I think soft money, if I had to like take a guess, is probably going to be the next direction of where our government might want to try to reform campaign finance laws. Just because soft money, the expenditures that are being spent on it are getting a little out of hand. I'm just going to move this guy real quick. So that's something, when you see it happen, you can be like, oh, the Bible teacher said this was going to happen. But then another important law that you need to know that came about in 2002 would be the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act. Again, this is going to come about because we are seeing so much money being spent in campaigns. It's going to be Senator John McCain and then Russ Feingold. So Republican McCain, Feingold was a Democrat, who came together to really push for greater campaign finance regulations. And they have been pushing for them for some time. And so they come up with this law in 2002. Sometimes it's referred to as the McCain-Feingold law. and passes both the House and the Senate, and President Bush, the second Bush, will sign it. The act is going to ban soft money contributions to national parties, and it's going to increase the limits on hard money donations to $2,000 from individuals. So before, recall, it was just $1,000. Now it's going to go to $2,000 for individuals because they said of inflation. $5,000 from political action committees, and $25,000 to national parties per election cycle. And recall again, when we're talking about election cycles, they count primaries and the general election as being completely different. So at this point in time, we're all individuals here. We are allowed to donate $2,000 to a candidate during the primary season. And then after the primary season is over, the general election is considered a completely different election. And so now we're allowed to donate $2,000 during the general election. It cut down on the soft money issue as far as national parties are concerned. So soft money donations to the National Republican Party and the National Democratic Party. But we still see soft money issues from interest groups. So again, there's still that loophole that's there. And that's something that will probably need to be fixed as we move into the future. This is a great little graphic. I forgot I made this pretty little slide about hard money and soft money. And it kind of just shows you again that hard money is given to a candidate and it's regulated, whereas soft money could be for party building activities and unregulated. And an example, again, just so you know, of a party building activity, which is commonly seen, is where you might have a commercial that won't mention either candidate, right? So it's not going to talk bad about candidate B. It's not going to talk positive about candidate A. But let's say that candidate A is a big supporter of gun control, okay? This commercial isn't going to mention anyone's name, but the commercial is going to go on and tell you all the reasons why we should have gun control reform in our country. And so it's not coming out and saying who you should specifically vote for, but if now you've watched this commercial and you're like, hey, I need to vote for the person who wants gun control, you're going to then go and look at the candidates and it's going to be like, oh, candidate A. They never mention candidate A's name, but subliminally, they're kind of directing you that way. So that's what's known as a party building activity, where you're running these commercial spots that are pretty much based on the issues that your political party stands for. You're not saying any candidates' names. You're just talking about the issue itself, because the idea is you're building your party by getting more people to support your party, but at the same time, you're building your party to get people to vote for that one candidate that's running for your party. And then dark money. This especially came out. I hope you all are Star Wars fans here. This came about really due to Citizens United and the court's ruling. We talked about Citizens United earlier this evening, but the court's ruling allowing for unlimited contributions to outside or soft money groups from individual citizens and other organizations. So here we have, I've never seen Star Wars, I'll be honest. I think it's supposed to be Luke Skywalker, who says, why can't we have fair elections with transparency? And then Darth Vader saying, you underestimate the power of the dark money. So dark money, again, something else is this the whole end Citizens United? So the Citizens United court case, I think that's probably is that what you're referring to too? Because it is, yes, the Citizens United court case, which a couple slides back, and I can jump back for you. Where is it? So we talked about this court case as far as corporations can now make political contributions to a committee as long as that committee did not formally coordinate with a candidate. The cartoonist seems opposed to Citizens United. Yeah, so if we jump back to this, the cartoonist is definitely talking about the fact that Citizens United and the ruling on it, because now it's going to allow these corporations to make donations to political candidates, could be a dangerous thing. And when you think about it, the whole argument was, freedom of speech. And they're making the argument in the Citizens United case as to whether or not, when you're saying that corporations can make donations, are you taking away their freedom of speech by doing that? And the Supreme Court basically said, yeah, you are, and that's why corporations are now allowed to make these donations. And then when you think about these 501c4 organizations, they're even more so allowed to get around the law because they're allowed to take unlimited, a 501c4 organization is allowed to take unlimited donations, and they're then allowed to donate that money to PACs. And when they donate it to PACs, the PAC has to say, oh, like the PAC needs to report, we got this money from this 501c4 organization, right? So they're reporting that to the FEC, but nobody's reporting where the 501c4 organization got the money from, because the 501c4 organization doesn't have to report that. So that's also become another loophole that we've seen recently, this work between these 501c4 organizations and PACs, and it's just another way to get around some of the reporting requirements that are out there, which is a little bit scary. So I have some practice questions, unless there are questions you all have. Otherwise, I have 2 multiple choice practice questions for us to jump into. All right, so we'll jump into these questions, and then obviously when we're done with these 2 practice questions, if you have questions, I'll take them then too. So a candidate for president creates a television advertisement to hurt his opponent's campaign. The advertisement features a series of quotes and actions taken out of context to make the opponent look unfit for the position of president. The candidate pays for the advertisement to be aired on many local stations, but does not disclose in the advertisement who has paid or created it, right? So it doesn't say like on the little bottom who's paying for this commercial. Which of the following policies could this candidate be seen as violating? A, Section 527 of the U.S. Internal Revenue Code. B, the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act of 2002. C, the Federal Election Campaign Act of 1974. Or D, Citizens United versus FEC. So we got one person saying B. So I will tell you that C, Brayson, is not the correct answer. The Federal Election Campaign Act of 1974 does set restrictions on campaign finance, especially to corporations and individuals, but it does not address campaign advertisements and taking responsibility for the funding and creation. So that's why C would be wrong. B is the correct answer, yes. So it was mainly created to eliminate soft money from impacting future elections, but a component was also created to deter attack ads from campaigns. So that's awesome. Those of you who answered correctly, we have another question to try out here. So which of the following statements describes a limitation that PACs have in attempting to influence candidates and campaigns? A, PACs are not allowed to communicate with the candidates' campaigns as they are only allowed to do independent expenditures. B, Citizens United versus FEC prevents PACs from taking campaign donations more than $1 million when working directly with the campaign. C, PACs are only allowed to work with interest groups and cannot use any money to help candidates campaigning for office. Or D, PACs are restricted to receiving campaign donations of a maximum of $5,000 and can only transfer, I just hit my slide and missed it, can only transfer that money to campaigns, parties, or other PACs. So we have one saying D. So Dakota, you are correct. The answer is D. PACs have a $5,000 individual donation cap and cannot receive donations from entities such as corporations. PACs have further restrictions on what they can do with the money, mostly just allowing them to transfer the money to campaigns, political parties, or other PACs. Nice job, Dakota. So those were my 2 practice multiple choice questions for this evening. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them before we kind of finish off tonight's slides. Actually, I jumped back here. So any questions about campaign finance? I mean, what are your feelings? Okay, you're young students who are going to be voting, hopefully maybe in the next election, 2020 election. If not, you'll be voting in the election after that. What are your feelings on the amount of money that's being spent on elections? Do you think the government should be regulating it more? Do you think the government should be regulating it less? Is there a fairness or equality factor that we need to work in, or is it whoever can make the bigger war chest is fair game? Can candidates contribute to their own campaign at whatever amount they want? Like, what are your thoughts on campaigns and how they spend their money, or where they get their money from, or what we can do in the future? Because since you all are future voters, maybe future representatives and senators and presidents. So I almost feel like it's a catch-22, right? Like it's a hard thing to think about, because in the sense of, as far as an individual, if they have a lot of money, like it's fair, I guess, in a sense, that they can contribute to their own campaign. But at the same time, like, you want to make sure it's not just like millionaires and billionaires, right, running for office. We want everyone to have that opportunity. But if you get more people donating to your campaign, I mean, does that show that you have more people supporting you, and then it makes you a better candidate? I mean, there's a lot that's kind of out there to think about. I'm not sure if there's a right or a wrong answer to this, right? But it's going to be interesting moving into the future, because we're progressively seeing all these different campaigns becoming more and more expensive and more money being spent. And even, I mean, we've talked a lot about the presidential campaign, but even if you look at Senate campaigns, House of Representative campaigns, you know, during the midterm elections, we saw more money being spent on those campaigns. And yes, a lot of it was because, you know, the Democrats were trying to win back one house, but still, the campaign money is rising. What question did you ask before? Oh, so I had asked, like, what were your thoughts, Dakota, as far as campaigns and how much money they spend? Do you think it should be regulated more? It should be regulated less? Do you think there should be limitations? Like, we should say campaigns can only spend X amount of money and that's it. So that way each campaign's spending the same amount? Or do you think it's, listen, if people want to donate to you, then people kind of want to donate to you? People. Yeah, so definitely, like what the FEC does now, as far as individuals can only donate X amount of money. So that's definitely something that seems to be working. What about your thoughts about, like, as far as, do you think campaigns should be limited to how much they can spend? Or do you think whatever money they collect, they should just be allowed to spend? Not on how much a campaign, because if they have the money, they should be able to use it. Yeah, and that's, you know, Dakota, that's an argument that most people make about campaigns. You know, the fact is, if a campaign is getting a lot of money, it means for the most part people are donating to that campaign, and they need to be the voice for those people. So what you said is pretty much what a lot of people will make the argument about. No matter what issue we pick in this country, right, we'll always have people who either agree or disagree. But it will be interesting moving forward, just due to the high level of expenses that we see, and kind of what I had mentioned earlier. You know, it's interesting in the sense that when campaigns were able to start using emails and things like that to solicit money, you know, you would have thought campaigns would have gotten a little bit less because they weren't paying to mail things out anymore. But we've seen campaigns getting a little bit more. But definitely on how much, yeah, I mean, it's definitely important that individuals all have that same level of the amount of money that they're allowed to donate as an individual, because you don't want anyone having more of an advantage in the president's ear, so to speak, because they've donated X amount of money where other people might not have had that. So yeah, thank you, Dakota, for sharing with us tonight, and for everyone else who was answering the questions and talking about the cartoons. Again, if you have any questions, just feel free to ask them before this stream ends, but I'm just going to go through what's kind of on the board for AP Government looking at next week. So on Monday night, it'll be weekly current events at 8:30 p.m. Eastern. We have a lot going on in this country, especially with the impeachment hearings starting this week. So that will definitely be a lively discussion on Monday night. Next Tuesday night, I'm back with voting and voting behavior at 7 o'clock. And then next Thursday night will be media ownership and bias, and that will be at 7 o'clock as well. So definitely join us. Get in a couple more streams before you have lots of turkey. So my next live one is next Tuesday night on the 19th. I'll be doing the voting and voting behavior at 7 p.m. And in that stream specifically, we'll be looking at voting laws, so like how we started basically with white men who own property being allowed to vote, and then all the changes along the way, the hardships that African Americans had to go through in order to get the right to vote, women, and what they had to go through in order to get the right to vote, and then different voting laws that have come about over the years in the U.S. And we'll also be looking at demographics, right? Like, this is the amount of people who can vote. This is the amount of people who actually go out and vote, and then breaking it down by ethnicity, by gender, even by religion, and looking at, are there more groups that maybe vote more than others? And looking at you all, the youth, who seem to be very riled up about politics and being active citizens, which is awesome, and what difference that might make in our future as far as voting is concerned. And then, of course, you can always get to us on social media at ThinkFiveable, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. If you have a question, if you have suggestions for topics, you're covering something in class that we are kind of missing out on, let us know. What about which groups vote for which party? Yeah, great question, Dakota. So when we're doing voting and voting behavior, we will definitely be taking a look at the regions of the country and which political parties they tend to vote for. And then again, also breaking it down as far as gender, ethnicity, and religions, and which groups they tend to vote for. And a couple weeks ago, and I think you were there for that, we kind of talked about how that changed over time, right? So how we saw the New Deal coalition, and we saw the changing of the people who support the Republican, the Democratic Party over time. This stream will focus more on currently, which we didn't do in that one stream. So this next stream on Tuesday night will be more of the the critical elections one, yeah. So this stream, whereas that kind of showed the changes over time as we were going through, this one will focus more on demographic groups today and where they tend to vote. So it'll be much more, in modern time instead of looking at critical elections from the past. So definitely an awesome one to check out. So again, social media, hit us up. Any other questions, comments, concerns, anything before we kind of say goodbye for the night? And then I'll join you all again next Tuesday. No, that gave me a good laugh, Dakota. Well, thank you as always for joining. I can always count on you to be here to join in and to participate, and I so much appreciate that. It makes it much better when I have someone with me here to talk to. Brayson, thank you if you're still there for joining tonight. I hope you both enjoy the rest of your week and have an awesome night, and I will see you next week.